So there's a popular train of thought going around in the Warhammer 40K community that I think got it wrong, and that's the Dornian heresy. While it has some really cool premises and things that could potentially have happened, I feel like they missed the mark on several things as well. So I employed my author skills as well as my really nerdy obsession with Warhammer 40K to create my own version that I'm calling the Blood Heresy. It was a lot of fun to create, and I hope you guys enjoy it. But make sure you guys let me know down in the comments below if you think I got anything wrong or things that need to be changed. I'm always happy to hear you guys' thoughts and opinions as well. So let's dive into it and talk about how it all started. In order for this to work, there's going to be one minor change to how things happened. And that is the Emperor is even more selfish and blood-driven and conquest-driven than he is in 30K. In 30K, he does tend to have a little bit more balance, but he balances on a very fine edge. So in order for this to go off, he steps over that edge and he embraces a lot more of the bloodshed and brutality of the Crusades instead of trying to find a way to have all of humanity embrace him. Although he does do that as well. So to start things off, the Emperor's favorite child is not really Horus. Horus is the first, but after a while, Horus just isn't doing his job well enough. So the Emperor embraces Morterian, Curze, and Angron. Those become his favorite boys and are used as a bludgeoning hammer across the galaxy to destroy and decimate anyone who stands in his way. And the Emperor fully embraces it. Unlike in the 30K timeline, because Morterian is as brutal as he is, the Emperor lets Morterian finish off his father and take control of his world by force. He does the same for Curze as well, letting Curze and the Night Haunter establish his rule more securely before pulling him away for the Crusades, giving him an even more elevated sense of brutality and justice. And on top of that, Angron. Instead of just yanking Angron out of the planet and just leaving things the way they are, he equips Angron and his soldiers just like he would anybody else and allows them to crusade across their planet and get justice for all of their slain gladiator brethren. The planet is purged in a violent and bloody mess that is on a whole nother level of violence that we don't really see in a lot of 30K. But by doing that, Angron isn't angry at the Emperor. He's now his most loyal and devout son, believing that the Emperor got there just in time to save him and provide the justice that he deserves. So that leads to those three becoming the most loyal and tight-knit parts of the Imperium, which is basically the opposite of what actually happened. On top of that, the Emperor realizes that because of his brutality, he needs a little bit of PR help. So in order to accomplish that, he allows Lorgar to preach the word that he is a god. And he is an extremely angry and vengeful god, but he will bless you if you try. So Lorgar ends up becoming basically his missionary and his chief diplomat, sent throughout the galaxy with his word bearers to preach the word of the Emperor and to establish that religion with brutality. So instead of burning Monarchia and Erebus running wild, Erebus is caught pretty quickly in what he's doing and thrown out or killed. So that level of instability from the word bearers is also something that isn't that common. Now, just like he did with Lorgar, he does the same thing with Magnus, giving Magnus license to study the warp and to grow, but he also teaches Magnus that everything should be channeled through the Emperor, and they shouldn't bargain with any of the collective beings in the warp. So by teaching him that there's parasites in the warp that want to prey on the Emperor's power, Magnus and the Thousand Sons believe that the Emperor is a god and are channeling their magic through him. By doing this, it causes a break between the Chaos Gods and Magnus and allows for a little bit more stability. There's still going to be warp problems and warp shenanigans that the Emperor is going to have help Magnus overcome, but It really does give them that license and stability that Magnus wanted, while still being able to work with the warp magic that he's always wanted as well. So now that we have the background established, let's talk about what actually kicked this off. And that is Alpharius and Omegon. Alpharius and Omegon find out about the red thirst that the Blood Angels have, and because Morterian is the War Master, not Horus, there is no real easing in of the red thirst. There's no giving Sanguinius time to discover this. And because of the jealousy that the Alpha Legion has towards the Blood Angels due to their supposed purity, Alpharius leaks this information to Lorgar. Lorgar then proceeds to give it to Morterian, who is not a fan. Not only are the Blood Angel Psykers, they're also vampires. And for Morterian, this is something he just can't allow. It's something that will destabilize everything he's working for. On top of that, Sanguinius already wasn't his biggest fan. So he sends in a purge team. He sends in Vulkan, Russ, and the Khan to clean it up. Because Russ is the executioner, Russ is put in charge, but it's figured that you're going to need the speed of the Khan and the White Scars to deal with Sanguinius, because you're going to have to kind of herd and control the Blood Angels, especially if the Red Thirst takes over, and you're going to need fire to purge them. So those three are sent in, but instead of immediately attacking, the three brothers have a hard time fully trusting Morterian. They're not big into believing him. He's not the most persuasive person in the world. And because of that, they decide to meet with Sanguinius first to see if there's any type of mix-up or exaggeration or confusion. And at that point, Sanguinius gives them a plea, pointing out the Emperor's abilities to have prevented this or stopped this, but he has not stepped in. And that the Emperor has fully embraced brutality and purges, which destroys the humanity of the Imperium and takes away the entire purpose of fighting for it. This then causes all three of his brothers to really rethink things, especially the brutality part hits a chord with both the Khan and Vulkan. Both of them are known for being more receptive to the people around them in the Imperium. So they begin to question which side they're on and why they're on that side, to be sure. And Russ, he's felt very pushed aside. He may be the Emperor's executioner, but he's not being used in the way he would be in canon 40K. So he's missing a lot of his purpose and is questioning a lot of things and is instead striving to be the best he can be so that his father will pay attention to him. Now, because of the way things are changed here, the Emperor wants more brutality, so he doesn't actually bring Dorn back to Terra. He brings Perturabo. He wants those games and traps and things that Perturabo is famous for. His labyrinths, his control sections, and his brutality are what the Emperor wants to defend Terra. But Dorn is still important. And the Eye of Terror is a little bit of a problem. He's concerned about it destabilizing and breaking open, or finding ways to really cause even more chaos to break into the galaxy. So he sends Dorn out to Cadia to begin fortifying the Eye of Terror and prevent it from escaping, as well as control anyone and everyone in the area who is affected by the warp in such a way that can't be easily justified. On top of that, Morterian is not a fan of Psykers, so he also sends Dorn out there to purge any Psykers that may be in existence there in Cadia or around it, because he doesn't trust them either. Well, this separation puts Dorn in a position to accept Vulkan when Vulkan comes for a visit. Vulkan comes and explains the situation, everything that's going on, and because Dorn is the son that's cast out instead of Perturabo, Dorn is very, very frustrated with everything that's going on. He feels completely abandoned because he was just stuck around the Eye of Terror and had been sitting there for hundreds of years not doing anything while the rest of his brothers run around and conquer the galaxy. He sent Imperial Fist contingents out to different parts to aid some of his brothers, but a lot of those brothers, like Vulkan and the Khan, are in kind of the same boat, where they're just used as cannon fodder to go clean things up. The Emperor doesn't really care how they go about it. He just wants the purging and the destruction on a level that the 40K Black Templars would be proud of. So Vulkan and Dorn have a conference and discuss the realities of what this all looks like and why they can't really trust the Emperor, and they definitely can't trust Morterian. And during this meeting, several of the Loyalists show up. Alpharius finds out about the meeting, and he brings in the Alpha Legion. He brings in some of the Word Bearers. He brings in some of the Iron Warriors, and he brings in some of the Death Guard to attack this conference while it's happening, causing a fairly big purge of both units. But because Dorn was paranoid about attack from both inside the Eye of Terror and outside, the Salamanders and Imperial Fists are able to hold and drive out the enemy before the Khan and Russ show up to aid them as well. This turns into a massive pitched battle and doesn't really end with anyone winning, but the rebels survive and are the first to be known of this cause. It then also causes a rallying force against the Emperor, where Sanguinius and the Khan are sent out to let the rest of the Imperium know about the Emperor's evils as well as the War Master's evils. And this concern does sway several people like Corax and a few of the other Loyalists. The Lion is actually influenced by the Watchers in the Night, explaining the same thing to him before Sanguinius shows up to reach out to him as well. The Watchers of the Night explain to the Lion that the Emperor has turned and is becoming a Chaos God just like the other four, and he's just as dangerous as dealing with Khorne or Tzeentch, and he needs to be stopped. If he doesn't, the entire galaxy will merge with the warp and become a terrible place to live. So the Emperor has to be stopped, and because of this, the Lion joins the fight. Now, this whole story ends pretty similar to how 40K ends, with the entirety of both sides ending up on Terra fighting over the throne room. And it results in a very similar situation where, in this case, Horus is slain by Sanguinius, and then the Emperor slays Sanguinius, but is mortally wounded in the process, resulting in basically the same thing we have right now. This does cause some schisms in which units fight for who, and because of this fight, several of the rebels actually do embrace Chaos Gods and begin to worship them instead. So let's talk about that next. We'll talk about the rebels first, who they embrace and where their standing is, and then we'll follow it up with the Loyalists in this version of the story. So let's talk about the rebels, and let's start with who actually started all of this, and that is the Blood Angels. As we talked about earlier, the Red Thirst was discovered by the Alpha Legion and used as a ploy to try and purge the Blood Angels from existence. They did not do that, and because Sanguinius is just as charismatic as Horus is, he was able to very quickly persuade several of his brothers to join him. Now, throughout the course of this fight, the Red Thirst and the Black Rage begin to rise, and because Sanguinius is extremely angry with the Emperor and looking for any means to stop it, they do eventually embrace Khorne. Khorne gets his actual champions that he always wanted, and this causes the Blood Angels to be extremely brutal, and giving into the Red Thirst and the Black Rage isn't actually considered a bad thing by the end of this. The Blood Angels actually see it as a boon of Khorne to become so obsessed with blood and embracing the Blood God. It's a really weird twist of fate, but it's one that I would really like to see. It'd be really cool to see that full vampiric Blood Angels embraced. I want to see almost Mephiston level vampire traits given to the true brutality that you see in some of the things in Age of Sigmar as well with the vampire courts, but giving that the sci-fi theme that will be just so gothically brutal. It'll be so much fun. Next is the second legion to leave the Imperium, and that would be the Salamanders. The Salamanders are an interesting one because when Vulkan is freed, he doesn't want to fight more. Instead, he does send some of his legion that is willing to fight to join the others, but he retreats back to his home world and begins to build a forge where he starts cranking out weapons at an astonishing level, but he's also unleashed from the bounds of the Imperium. And he starts learning about demon forging and embraces Vashdor. And Vashdor makes an appearance in the story far earlier. So Vulkan becomes almost the demon prince of creation, driving forward everything he can technologically and turning out these demon engines and demon weapons and giving them to his brothers to use on a scale that has never been seen before. It's an obsession that is staggering. And because of this, he retreats into a demon world to be able to create his technologies while equipping all of his units with warp flamers and big hulking tanks and Mauler fiends and all of these demon engines that allow them to destroy and embrace the flames even more. Now, the con is going to be the weird one here. Because he doesn't really fit into the warp god trajectory and is very against anything and everything warp related, he actually ends up just breaking away. He has always kind of questioned whether serving the Imperium is actually a good idea or not. And when it's proven to not be, he breaks off on his own. He teams up with a couple of the other primarchs around him, being Guilliman and Corax, to establish their own Imperium that is more akin to their beliefs. Now, his neighbors don't always stay good and do embrace the warp, but the Khan is willing to work with them as long as his people are treated properly and he's able to run his Imperium the way it should be. And it becomes a bastion of balance and hope for refugees as they flee the wars with the Imperium and try and find some hope of peace and prosperity. And this peace and prosperity really does fuel a lot of what the actual rebels use to fight. It's where a lot of their manpower comes from. It's where a lot of their magic and psychers come from, because the White Scars are fully willing to embrace that. And it creates this balance that brings a lot more function to the rebellion and doesn't have as much instability as you see in the Horus Heresy. Next, we have the Raven Guard. The Raven Guard is a really unique one as well that quickly embraces the freedom from the Imperium. They have never really been a fan with how the Emperor uses them, both on the battlefield and in tactics. So when approached by Jagatai Khan, Corax is very, very willing to embrace the rebellion and be used the way it's intended. He's able to fully study things like shadow walking and tactics and manipulation, as well as shadow force warfare, which attracts Tzeentch. Tzeentch is drawn to Corax and the Raven Guard, and they do embrace it. They embrace the ability to shadow walk and future sight and all of the fun stuff that Tzeentch can allow. And it allows a lot of the people under their control to embrace Tzeentch as well, leading to the rise of Sangor, and the bird motif becomes far more prevalent, with several of the Space Marines morphing into bird-human hybrids and becoming a lot of what the Tzeentch aesthetic wants to be, despite the current Thousand Sons looking very Egyptian. Next is Dorn. Dorn is going to be a very interesting twist that a lot of people will probably find interesting. Because Dorn had fortified the Eye of Terror, all of a sudden that gave the traitors a new foundation, especially those who are embracing the Dark Gods. It gives them a path to travel back and forth and commune in a fortified way that the Imperium just can't seem to break. Because Perturabo is stuck on Terra, trying to fortify that, he's not around to try and break Dorn's protections around the Eye of Terror and throughout the bastions in the rest of the galaxy. For example, several of the Imperial Fists are sent to go aid the Khan and Guilliman as they establish their border with the Imperium and establish that almost quarter of the galaxy under their control. But on top of that, you do have the faith-driven, or more faith-driven Imperial Fists. And that is led by Sigismund. Sigismund is almost the Erebus of the Imperial Fists. Dorn doesn't care for it, but because it's necessary in order to maintain a good relationship with the Eye, Sigismund is what becomes kind of a Dark Apostle. He embraces the worship of all four of the gods and becomes kind of the temple paladin. He protects it from anything that is a threat to it and allows pilgrims in and out and allows for that structure to really become a stability. Now, Dorn does leave the Eye of Terror in order to attack Terra and is actually killed in that battle. He's killed in an attempt to tunnel underneath several of the walls of the palace and ends up being killed in a fight against Perturabo directly. Because Dorn is not fully himself and a lot of his unit has been pulled in different directions, and frankly, he's kind of confused about what he actually is. He's put in a position where he's not ready for Perturabo at his peak, creating a labyrinth underneath the galleries of the palace, as well as things like the Lion's Gate and all of the Imperial City. And this leads to Dorn basically walking into a trap and losing his head. But there's a lot of very interesting things that he does throughout the story to establish what the future will look like. Next, we have the Dark Angels. The Dark Angels are a really unique one because it's believed that a lot of the Dark Angels may be actual psychic gnolls or are very against a lot of what the warp brings. Now, Cypher and the Watchers in the Night team up instead of embracing the warp and actually convince the Lion that he needs to side with the rebels. On top of that, he needs to work with the Null Realm where the Watchers are from to establish a bastion and keep the warp from taking over completely, whether that be through the Emperor or through some of the Lion's brothers. Now, the Emperor is the bigger threat, and if they can take down the Emperor, it would allow the Lion to establish Caliban as a separate kingdom and keep the warp away. And because of that, the Lion does side with them, but it's a very loose association. The Lion uses his abilities and techniques to hunt down and pick off any of the legions that are not near Terra in order to prevent anything from sneaking up on them. And that is his purpose, and that's where he drives. Next, we're going to talk about the Ultramarines. This one is probably going to cause the most chaos out of any of the god decisions here. So let's dive into it. Because the Ultramarines are obsessed with the 500 worlds, and their focus is pulled back in, especially during the initial rebellion, Guilliman does embrace the path of the rebel because the Emperor is so brutal in pretty much everything he does. And he's unleashed Curze a few times on the 500 worlds, causing mass death and mass destruction throughout those worlds instead of letting Guilliman run them the way he wants to. But as everything's breaking out, a plague rips through the 500 worlds, and Guilliman's forced to confront the reality that he can't do anything about it until he's approached by Nurgle, offering to let his people live if Guilliman swears allegiance to Nurgle. And after a lot of destruction has happened and a lot of people have died, Guilliman finally breaks and embraces Nurgle. This leads to the 500 worlds being filled with things like Plague Walkers and all of the Ultramarines embracing that as well, turning into this vile, fetid world that is still super organized and super peaceful, allowing the spread and growth of rot and decay to fill an entire section of the galaxy. They're also able to still trade in a lot of things with the rest of the galaxy as well, and manufacture really unique weapons, especially bioweapons and things like that, to continue to aid the war effort and crank out a lot of troops. Instead of the Ultramarine Guard Legions, you now have those Guard Legions operating as Plague Walkers instead. It's a really terrifying sight to see this legion of the doomed and the guilty. Okay, next we have the Space Wolves. The Space Wolves are another one that's going to be pretty fun, and I have a feeling a little controversial, but I think this is the best fit for them for sure. There's a lot of really cool things that could happen if the Space Wolves were released from the need for duty. I did think about them potentially being the Servants of Khorne, but that didn't feel right because there's a lot more to the Space Wolves. They're driven a lot by mythos and by camaraderie and by enjoying the pleasures of life in order to kill properly. And because of that, I think this desire to enjoy the pleasures of life will push them towards Slaanesh. And while Russ is destabilized because he doesn't have duty, he would embrace things like drinking and partying and all of the inhibitions and exhaustions that Slaanesh brings to the table, giving him a purpose to live for. Now, he's not going to go as unstable as Fulgrim does. Fulgrim embraces it to a different level than Russ will. Russ will never fully trust Slaanesh, but he will embrace the hedonistic tendencies and drive that desire for a perfect duty and a perfect world where he can enjoy himself because he doesn't enjoy serving the Emperor. And because of this, a lot of the Space Wolves will embrace Slaanesh a lot more than Russ will, but Russ will still serve Slaanesh. He'll never become the full demon prince that Fulgrim is, although embracing the wolf inside him will turn him wolfen. And Russ will become a semi-stable, kind of werewolf-esque demon prince of Slaanesh. And now, last but not least, is the Iron Hands. The Iron Hands kind of get stolen from the story, both in the Dornian Heresy and the Horus Heresy, but in this, they don't. Because Vulkan starts to embrace the world of the Forge, Ferros is drawn into that. He enjoys that kind of thing and quickly becomes Vulkan's test dummy, is the best way to put it. The Iron Hands quickly embrace Vastor as well and serve him by implementing all of the cool technologies that Vulkan is coming up with, whether it be demon tech or just normal tech that he wasn't allowed to mess with. You see the rise of artificial intelligence, and the Iron Hands begin to fully embrace the flesh is weak mantra that originally Ferros wasn't a fan of. Ferros does become influenced over time to give up more and more of his humanity to become more and more like his new god Vastor, embracing the mechanical and using his living metal mechadermis to outfit himself even more, eventually becoming a Demon Prince of Vastor, where he's fully embraced in metal, and the living metal of his arms allows him to move freely in ways that humans don't. It quickly replaces all of his human bits and gives him a lot of power over the warp and over demon tech and things like that. So now we've talked about the rebels, let's talk about the loyalists in this faction. This section will be a little bit shorter because honestly the rebels needed more description, more detail to really understand why I was thinking the way I did. Now, for the Loyalists, let's start with the easy ones, Lorgar. Lorgar's troops were never really sent into the Deep Crusade. They were used as a backline force that would create the worship of the Emperor and fully stabilize the galaxy as the other legions went behind them. They were often seen more as a police force than an actual conquering legion, but the Emperor was okay with that. He created a lot more stability, and the worship gave him more power. So he allowed them to roam the inner galaxy and follow behind those in front of him. And this positioned Lorgar to be one of the first to be able to pull back to Terra because he was already near the inner core. The same goes for Perturabo, whose legion was around Terra, building things like labyrinth traps, using asteroid fields to create labyrinths that ships would have to navigate and cause instabilities in warp lanes. And all of this led to a real function around Terra that is more like the Minotaur's caves in ancient Greek myths instead of the castle bastion that it is in the Horus Heresy. Next, Angron is Angron. Not much changes for him except for he stays loyal. So kind of like Russ's loyalty in the Horus Heresy, Angron is the Emperor's lapdog. He will do what the Emperor says with no questions at all. His legion is more accepted by him because they went and helped him in New Syria. They helped with the purge of all of the High Riders and all of the people who tormented and tortured Angron. And the gladiators that are able to accept Gene Seed and become world eaters are embraced by the Legion as well. So instead of that on again, off again hatred of his Legion, the world eaters are stable and they grow. But when it starts, they are far away from Terra and have to contend with the Dark Angels coming to hit them from the rear, as well as the Ultramarines later on. And this leads to them barely making it back to Terra in time for the fight, and they really don't make that big of a difference. Next is Curze. Curze is Curze, not much changes there either. He's also in the far reaches of the galaxy, running as a terror frontline for several of his brothers, including Angron. And his legion is pretty quickly decimated and scattered by the Dark Angels because they were too far ahead of everything to really understand what was going on until it was too late and they were getting pummeled. So they're a legion that is heavily stripped back for what they are, and they try and survive kind of like the Raven Guard is in the Horus Heresy. Next is Horus. While Horus isn't the favorite son like he is in the Horus Heresy, he is still more stable. Morterian uses him as a second in command and uses him to aid with the politics of everything because Horus is very good at the political game. Because of this, after the Emperor falls, Horus is actually brought in to serve as the head of the Council of Terra and represent his father, while Morterian is the head of the military. And those two work together throughout to try and stabilize the Imperium after all of the chaos and destruction that happened. The Space Wolves had been scattered and split into several different branches of the galaxy. Some of them made it back to Terra, some did not. Some were massacred and some were not. And their entire goal is to try and reunite and make their way back through all of the warp traps and warp storms that emerged during this. And even into 40K, that is where they stand. They're still scattered, still stuck, and still stranded. Some are trapped in the warp, some are not. And they're trying to figure out how to get back successfully. Now, Garvia Loken actually split off a large portion of them, along with several of the rebels, and broke from his father. So there is a chunk that turned and become more loyal to anyone that will accept them. They become almost roving pirates throughout the galaxy. Next, we have the Thousand Sons and Magnus. The Thousand Sons were a lot more focused locally because the Emperor let them do what they needed to do. A large portion of them were home when the rebellion broke out. And this and their positioning put them right at the head of the border between the Ultramarines, the White Scars, and the Imperium. So they had to form a bastion there and form a border to protect against the rebels' push. And because of the Stormseers and the Raven Guard's ability to attack in shadow, the Thousand Sons are pressed on all ends and are constantly seeking reinforcements. They do receive some reinforcements from the Luna Wolves, but they're barely able to hold. And eventually Russ shows up to aid the fight, and they burn Prospero. Prospero suffers the same fate, and the Thousand Sons are driven off to Terra to try and defend it, along with the scattered remnants of several of the other legions. Next is the Death Guard. The Death Guard are a pretty obvious one as well. Morterian is the War Master. Now, in this version, the War Master does not turn. So his army is instead scattered, sent to aid a lot of the other legions in conquering the galaxy, and only a small portion is retained that can get back to Terra. A lot of the Death Guard is destroyed and mopped up, which severely limits Morterian's ability to command, especially when it comes to some of his brothers like Angron, who only recognizes power, but the Death Guard isn't the strongest. Their individual people are, but they're one of the weaker legions by the end of this. Next is Fulgrim. Fulgrim is a very unique one. His drive for perfection instead doesn't drive him to Slaanesh, it drives him closer to the Emperor, given everything that the Emperor is doing, and he's accepting a lot more accolades. So Fulgrim is actually pulled back to aid Perturabo in his cause and create some reinforcements to further bolster the galaxy. With the Emperor's children being as limited and as weak as they are, there's not much else they can do. But during the fight, Fulgrim decides he wants to try and talk some reason into his brothers that haven't turned to a dark god. At the time, that is the Khan and Ferris. When they don't listen, Fulgrim's belief that he's the best sword fighter causes him to challenge the Khan, not realizing that the Khan has every bit of Fulgrim's measure because Fulgrim is always talking and always showing off. This results in Fulgrim losing his head at the gates of Terra. It's a brutal fight. The Khan does walk away with several wounds, but he also walks away with Fulgrim's head. And last of the Loyalists is the Alpha Legion. The Alpha Legion may have caused this whole thing, and it is basically their fault. But because of everything, it does cause them to really embrace their full CIA-ness, attempting to sneak in and destabilize and steal. But unfortunately for Alpharius, he gets caught trying to steal the shadow walking abilities of the Raven Guard and is brought to the gates of Terra and slain in front of his brother in a very, very brutal fashion. This causes Omegon to destabilize a little bit and seek revenge against the Raven Guard at all costs, abandoning his post on Terra, and he officially embraces the full moniker of Alpharius moving forward. So Omegon is no more and Alpharius is reborn. So that was the Blood Heresy. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below, and if you guys have stayed this long, I appreciate it. Make sure you like and subscribe. We have a lot more cool stuff like this coming. And I'm thinking we'll maybe do some more lore and fan theory discussions as well to bring more variety to this channel so that you guys get a little bit more different stuff instead of just the lore accurate lists and the fiction to 40K. Now, if you guys would like to see any cool fan theories discussed, let me know in the comments below. I'm always looking for new cool stuff. And if you guys have any armies you want me to do lore accurate lists on, or books that you want to inspire cool lists, let me know in the comments below as well. I'm super excited to do those as well and bring these to you every week. And I hope you guys have enjoyed this, and I'll see you guys later.